Hello and welcome back to the Peace Grows Here podcast. I'm your host, Yelena Theofilates, with my Blooming Heart Hypnotherapy and Coaching. And in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about how to use the framework that I've been using myself, made of three C's. And you're going to find out what those C's stand for in just a moment to help yourself on your healing journey from anxiety, whether it's something that you have been working with the majority of your lifetime as you remember yourself, or that's something new that's coming up for you, like for a lot of my clients who are transitioning from becoming a solopreneur to having a team. A lot of uncertainties come up, and we need to be able to handle them in the most optimal way. That's also where you can plug it in. Anyway, what do those C's stand for, and how can you use them to move through any kind of turbulent times of your life in a smooth fashion? The first C stands for curiosity, the second C stands for clarity, and the third C stands for compassion. So, when you're dealing with anxiety, the first step is to become curious about that. And that might sound very straightforward and simple, but a lot of times when we're dealing with stressful, anxiety provoking situation and just the sensation itself, we like to try to avoid it, to ignore it, come back to it some other time. And sometimes we just got to keep going with our day. That is true. But if it keeps coming back, if it's becoming a pattern, that's a really big sign that it needs to be addressed and not resented, because sometimes we resent feeling anxiety. It never comes when we have the time or luxury to spend our time feeling anxious, and we might start feeling resentful around ourselves feeling anxious and avoid engaging with it for that reason. In this way, we only prolong our own suffering, because if we only can have some curiosity about what's going on within us and channel that curiosity in a very specific way towards self understanding, towards what's driving anxiety on a background for specifically us, and just in general, we might just find our way through what we're dealing with towards a more optimal outcome, whatever is it for you, by also being compassionate with ourselves along the way. And that's, of course, the goal of becoming curious. And that's the third C. We're going from curiosity to being compassionate with ourselves, with our process. And the middle C, the one that we have to go through to get to compassion from curiosity, is clarity. And clarity comes when we stick around in the curious mode long enough, figuring out, okay, what's coming up for me? Where is it coming from? To the point that we get clarity about that. And when we have clarity about what's coming up for us, we can release any kind of feelings of self blame, anxiety, also no longer a mystery for us. And when it's no longer a mystery, so much more manageable to deal with. But ultimately, we can see anxiety through. We can see what are those factors that play a role in us feeling that way. And with that understanding, we can, instead of criticizing ourselves for feeling a certain way or pushing that anxiety away, we can shift into a self compassionate mode and feeling compassionate toward ourselves. Having that attitude has an amazing soothing effect on our nervous system, on our mind, just on our psyche in general. And that's a lot of times all we need to really begin to release anxiety, come to a much more calm place within. So we start with being curious, we get clarity because we spend enough time in curiosity, channeling it towards self understanding, and then as a result of that self understanding, we come to compassion. And let me give you a very specific example. And this is my personal example from my life, how I have been healing my anxiety and ultimately how I'm helping others to do the same. I first did not notice that I personally have been moving through those three phases of curiosity, clarity, and compassion. But the more I spend time helping others, the more I realize that those are very predictable stages of healing anxiety. So, the very first one, the curiosity phase for me, began when I got curious about how my smoking habit, smoking tobacco, was intertwined with anxiety. At that point, smoking habit was my number one concern. But I also realized that if I would help my smoking, I would also help my anxiety. That was about the time when I was in grad school. Interesting enough, learning to be a therapist, which what I'm doing now, trying to help myself and others. And that was a very stressful time in my life. And I smoked tobacco prior to that, like years prior to that. And I quit cold turkey without really learning much about how habits are created or anything else. So that means when that habit came around again, when big stress came around again in my life in the form of my grad school, I was not prepared to deal with that habit. I didn't know its mechanisms. I didn't know how to approach effectively. So the next thing I know, I buy loose cigarettes every other day or something like that. I don't remember right now. For me, even smoking one was pretty serious matter. I was not like smoking packs of cigarette, anything like that, but I felt quite self ashamed of myself because of I know I was given into something that was not good for me. Rationally, I did know that, but whatever reason, that rationality, that willpower, that inner knowing, oh, that's just not great. And where am I doing? I'm really not walking my talk in terms of applying all of those coping skills. This is not a coping skill whatsoever, smoking cigarettes. I mean, just not to demonize it, I would have to say perhaps it is a coping skill, but there's nothing else is left. But ultimately, of course, it's unsustainable and very damaging to your health. So I knew all of that, but it was not enough for me to quit. And knowing that, I felt only more ashamed of myself. I'm like, hey, you know all of this. Like, why are you still doing this? And there was not a lot of self compassion in that attitude. I would beat myself up to pulp every time I would smoke a cigarette. And the next thing I know, I was smoking again. Like, what's up with that? So I decided to get curious about what was going on and decided that I need a little more support and help in trying to figure that out. So I didn't have time to go to therapy because I was in grad school. So I bought a book, The Craving Mind by Dr. Jod Brewer, who is like my hero. I'm going to include the book's title in the show notes to this episode. So hold on. I don't have to write anything yet. But I highly recommend this book if you have any kind of habit that you want to release and understand just how much our society has been. I'm not a fan of all the word programmed, but how much of our society is now revolves around creating experiences that actually craviogenic, like Dr. Judd says. How much of what we do actually mind up creating a habit for us that we don't really like. This book is amazing. It's not about just a smoking habit, it's about all other habits. So check it out. So I picked that book up and I learned about how habits are created and why they're so hard to shake off. And I'm not going to get into that right now, but that clarity, that self understanding that I then applied by becoming more self aware of, like, oh, this is what I'm doing exactly like the book says. Now I see it through. Now I understand why it's so hard to get rid of it. And it's not my fault per se. It's just the way my human brain in general, has evolved that is causing that, that makes me prone to that. Oh, okay. I can be a little more self-compassionate as a result of that. Plus, I don't exactly remember, but I think he does point out, maybe not in that book, but in the following book, how much when we criticize ourselves, it actually has an opposite effect. And I definitely noticed that when I would self-criticize myself for smoking a cigarette, instead of wanting to smoke less, I wanted to smoke more. It's because when I would criticize myself, my nervous system would take it as an attack, which it definitely was an attack on myself. And that would dysregulate my nervous system even more. And what did I did already? What I had been doing when I was dysregulated or anxious, I was smoking a cigarette. So by being self-critical, we're actually hurting ourselves when it comes to inviting habits. The path through and out of those loops is to gain clarity about what's going on, get understanding, and then apply it, first of all, to be compassionate, and also ultimately, of course, use the tools that actually work to unwind those habits. Willpower is not one of those tools that you really want to be relying on when it comes to unwinding habits or anxiety, healing anxiety. For example, we try sometimes to like command ourselves to feel anxious. Does it really work? Why did we decide that it should work anyway? When we are commanding ourselves to either quit or stop doing this or anything else of habitual nature, we are using our rational brain, which is a beautiful mechanism, to affect something in our emotional brain, which is also amazing and great and helping our survival at all times. But the problem is that our rational brain, our prefrontal cortex, is much, 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 much younger than our emotional brain from the evolutionary standpoint. And when we're trying to command ourselves by using willpower not to eat that cupcake or not to worry or etc., whatever else that you're dealing with, ultimately, we're going to run out of that juice because the mechanism in our emotional brain that we're trying to change is actually so much more powerful because by default, our emotional part of the brain is so much more robust and developed than our rational part of the brain that we are destined to fail at some point. And I failed many times when I gave into that impulse of smoking. And I did not realize why, but knowing that, I'm basically using quote unquote weaker part of the brain to affect a mechanism that is in the part of the brain that is so much more robust and developed than the one that I'm using to work with it. No wonder it's not working for me. Plus, when we stress, and this is where I would smoke or get anxious, I try to like not worry. This is where our rational part of the brain is weaker just by default because the emotionality, the energy from our nervous system rise up to face the challenge. And if we are caught up in that overwhelm, this is like the last moment when we can call upon our rational brain. Our rational brain is not really there anymore when we are overwhelmed and stressed out. Or if it's there, is just not as capable to bring us back to center. This is why when it comes to habits and when it comes to calming ourselves down, it's much more effective to approach our body, our emotions, our nervous system first and foremost. And this is why my mantra when it comes to anxiety, regulate your nervous system first and think later. Because when our body feels calmer, when our emotions have come down, it's so much more easier to reason with ourselves, so much more easier to use that willpower. But before we get to that, we need to make sure that our body is feeling safe again, feeling regulated. And realizing all of that also made me much more understanding of why every time when I would try to think my way out of anxiety, it wouldn't work. Because again, thinking our way of anxiety a lot of times only makes it worse just because of how anxiety is born in the brain. And that's something I also learned by being curious from the second book of Dr. Jod's by Dr. Jod called Unwinding Anxiety, where he talks about how anxiety is perpetuated as a habit, where the main mechanism, although there's quite a few of them, that perpetuates it, or main behavior that we engage into that perpetuates it, it's the mental behavior of worrying, when we chew on the same thoughts all over again, a lot of times thinking that that's our way out of it, worrying, because we technically, in theory, we're problem solving, we think we are, but ultimately we're just driving ourselves deeper. But we're so accustomed to do the worry behavior every time uncertainty hits that we don't really realize that it actually, first of all, driving us deeper into anxiety, as I said, and secondly, is perpetuated as a habit, as something that our brain get hooked on, as if it was an addictive substance of some sort. And why? It is because worrying provides benefits for us. Some of those we are not even aware of. A lot of times we're not aware of them, but let me just list them really quickly, the same ones that Dr. Jott lists in his book, and see if you can relate to this. So worrying makes us feel better, and that is enough for our brain to get, oh, this is great, let me do it again. Because it allows us to avoid feeling the fear which is underneath that anxiety. This is our nervous system that shifted into the flight and fight response of fear, in a more simple language. And this is not comfortable. Feeling fear is not really pleasant. So, worrying actually allows us to dissociate from that and live in our head, which is a little more comfortable for us for whatever reason, even though we all know that worrying is actually not that pleasant either. But this is the point, that is more pleasant just enough than the fear itself, that allows us to get hooked on it. Also, worrying provides an elusive benefit of allowing us to feel like we are in more control, because at least in theory, we are problem solving, and problem solving means getting more control of a situation. And also when there's nothing really we can do at the moment, because whatever we're thinking about is going to happen in the future, and you just don't have enough information to really do anything about it. Let's say you're waiting for a response from someone who interviewed you for a job, and you don't know what to do because you haven't heard from them yet. Should you like look for another job, or like etc., and you start worrying. And the best thing in this situation you can do, of course, you can problem solve and create a plan. What happens if this person responds? What happens if it doesn't? But a lot of times what we do, we get sucked into like, oh, what if they don't respond, or what if they say no, and we da 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 da, here we go again. We're trying to solve it uncertainty of the situation because it feels threatening to our nervous system and our just psyche in general. But we don't realize that we're not really doing that much. But worrying gives us this feeling like, oh, I'm doing something, I'm really taking care of this, while in reality we're not really taking care of this. But this is like, this feeling, oh, I'm doing something, is enough for our brain to get hooked on it. And learning all of that made me realize how addicted I was to worrying, to the behavior. And it didn't just create a change in how I approach uncertain situations overnight. I would still had to become really mindful about what do I do in response to when anxiety provoking situation comes around. It was a process of teaching myself how choose something else but worrying, but knowing how deceptive it is in this sense, that is lies to us that it's provide all of those benefits, but it doesn't, made me realize that, yeah, I was addicted to worrying, and this is not great. I was addicted to smoking and worrying, and them both together were not helping me to have a better mind, a calmer mind, more resilient mind. They were basically just perpetuating themselves as habits. And unfortunately, this is what habits do. They seem to be like they're our best friends in some way. Worrying takes away a little bit of that fear, smoking takes a little bit of out that anxiety for just a few minutes. And this is enough for our brain to get hooked on and forget that long term, here we're back again in the same overwhelming situation because we have not learned how to deal with this properly. So when I learned all of that, I realized that no wonder I get more anxious when I worry and I have such troubles moving through uncertain situation because I'm definitely doing the wrong thing when it comes to approaching them in a smart way. No wonder I get more stressed than ever. So I developed a good amount of compassion for myself. I realized that, because of the way my rational mind likes to try to think its way out of anxiety, because this is what it was made to do, to plan, to um, try to look into the future. And it's a beautiful function of our prefrontal cortex. This is how it helps us to survive. But in anxiety provoking situation, in uncertain situation, that ability of our brain gets hijacked by fear. And before I know it, I'm no longer thinking my way out of anxiety. I'm worrying myself deeper into it, but learning about how easy to get stuck in that cycle between fear and worry that are both building blocks of anxiety pretty much for everyone made me realize that I can be, first of all, more self compassionate and understand why I feel anxious. There is anxiety, there is uncertainty in situation. No wonder I start feeling a little uncomfortable. My brain don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty never felt good, whether for ancient cave people who would like enter a dark cave and they would have to stay alert until they find out if it was safe. Or right now, when I like, let's say, I don't know if I'm going to pay my so and so bill next month. This doesn't feel great. Of course, I'm going to start feeling a little, there is that feeling in my body. It's not really that great. But now, when I know how anxiety is born in the brain, I can pause, I can breathe, I can remind myself not to think, not to believe everything that my mind thinks, and choose how to address it in a smart way, which is for me is to regulate first, as I said earlier, and to think later. And if you have been listening to my previous solo podcast, I actually did three of them on this topic to unpack my mantra, the regulate first, think later, what I mean by that. So feel free to go and explore them. But the idea is that instead of trying to think my way out of anxiety, now I regulate my nervous system first by doing somatic techniques that kind of bypass mind, unless I'm using self affirmations that very positive to feel better at the moment. But I'm really, really attentive to my self talk at those times. If I'm sliding back into the worrying mode, I stop thinking what I'm thinking. I'll go back to purely somatic techniques. And then when I'm ready, I shift back into thinking mode and problem solve for real. And this is all how I do it personally in my life. I move from being curious, realizing that I need more information to help myself because I was just getting stuck in smoking and anxiety. After I got clear about what drives my anxiety from underneath it all and the smoking habit and habits in general, I realized, first of all, I need to be more compassionate to myself and also stop using the tools that ultimately don't work and drive me into a problematic state deeper, whether it's a willpower that ultimately fails or it's trying to think my way out of anxiety. I'll ultimately trying to use my rational brain what it's not at its best and what is much more helpful for us to go through the body first and then go back to thinking. So curiosity, clarity, compassion. How does it sound to you? Let me know in a DM on my Instagram if you follow me there. My handle is my blooming heart hypnotherapy, all one word, or send me an email at hello at my blooming heart mybloomingheart.com. That's my email address. My website is mybloomingheart.com. Of course, if you want to check it out, please let me know if this is helpful. Do you want me to do more of this kind of episodes? Because ultimately, even though I derive so much benefit from just talking about all of this and put it all into this easily digestible for myself, hopefully in others manner, I really want to make this time, this listening time to the Peace Girls podcast valuable and useful for you most of all. So feel free to shoot me a text, email or a DM. And if you found this podcast valuable, please give me a review. There's like a button with three dots on it. When you scroll up in the window for the podcast on Spotify, an app, and you press it and you give it 5 stars if you will, if you move to do so, and you're done. And if you're an Apple, you can actually write me a few things there and give me your feedback over there. I would love to make this more interesting and better for you because this is ultimately for you. I want everyone to be able to empower themselves with a clarity of mind about what's going on with them to break free from anxiety and have a better life. Thankfully, we have the science that we need to make sure that we know the right facts. Of course, then we have to take them further to applying them. And that could be my next episode, how to take the information that we learn, like the one I learned about understanding how anxiety born in the brain, and actually put it into practice. I definitely can do that. So stay tuned for the next episode and have an amazing, beautiful, curious, compassionate, clear mind and day. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Talk to you soon.